they would have to say, well, it happened to them as well. They took off from Jerusalem. They took an entire day before they realized that Jesus wasn't with them. Now, they were only a little upset. Actually, they were a lot upset. They ended up searching for 3 days. And when they finally found Jesus, he was very calm when he said, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I must be about my Father's business?" Now, I think these same questions face us the Sunday after Christmas. Peace and goodwill fade. Christmas leaves so many of us wanting in one sense or another. And the text invites us to wonder about why Mary and Joseph looked for Jesus in all the wrong places. Now, here's the situation. Passover is over. Mary and Joseph are packing up their things. They're headed home with their traveling companions. Now, a couple of things you must understand right away. We'll give you a couple of numbers. It's 91 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem. The other thing, in Jerusalem, during normal times, there were about 25,000 people. But during festival times, it gets closer to 100,000 people. So Mary and Joseph pack up their things and they head out. But the night after the journey began, they went to look for Jesus in amongst all of the travelers. But they couldn't find him. So what did Mary and Joseph decide to do? They turned back to Jerusalem to look for Jesus after being one day without him. And that was probably, in that first day, probably a distance of 20 miles. So they had to travel back 20 miles. Now, that's kind of a long walk. Now, Janet and I usually travel 3 or 4 miles every day. We keep track on our Fitbits so we know. But this is a much longer trip and a much lonelier one. Now, this is the only passage in the Bible that tells us anything about Jesus' life between his birth, the immediate aftermath, and his baptism before he started his 3-year ministry. Now, this is the only incident in the text, and these are the only words that Jesus is recorded to say before his public ministry began. Now, not much is known about these intervening years. We know Jesus had 4 half-brothers, Joseph, Simon, James, and Jude. We know he had sisters, and it doesn't say in the Bible, but Bible experts believe the sisters were named Mary and Salome, but Scriptures doesn't name them. We also have to assume that Joseph died while Jesus was quite young. That being the case, he had the responsibility for the support of the entire family because he was the eldest son. Having learned a trade from his father, he worked as a carpenter until he was about 30 years of age. Now, the book of Luke reminds us again that Jesus' parents kept God's law in everything that they did. Luke doesn't mention the wise men, the flight to Egypt, the slaughter of the innocents. Now, Matthew's gospel does because it was written to a Jewish audience. And Matthew knew how important it was for the Jews to recognize that Jesus was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Luke takes yet another opportunity to emphasize the family's obedience to all of God's laws. Now, this is critical because many unbelievers would argue later that not only was Jesus not divine, but he didn't follow the law of Moses either. But Jesus always honored, defended, and obeyed Mosaic law. Now, one of the things the law required was that all adult men make the journey up to Jerusalem 3 times a year, once for each of the great feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and the Tabernacles. Now, these journeys were difficult for an awful lot of people because of the distance and because of the dispersion of the Jews around the world. So many couldn't make all 3 trips. For those who would make it once a year, Passover became the preferred feast. Now, women and children were not required to go, but those who did were called very devout. Now, this particular Passover would have been important to Jesus because he was about to become accountable to the law, because he was about to have his bar mitzvah. Now, the family had been in Jerusalem for 8 days, the 7 days of the festival, and Passover. But now Joseph's family is headed home. Again, let's keep in mind that's 91 miles. It takes anywhere from 4 to 7 days to make the trip. Now, people often traveled together in caravans, well, for the companionship and to protect themselves from robbers. Now, these caravans seemed kind of like what we used to call wagon trains, without ward bond, but wagon trains nonetheless. It was on this return trip to Nazareth that Joseph and Mary misplaced Jesus. Now, you wonder how they could misplace Jesus. Well, you have to understand how the caravan was set up. Women and children were in the front. They led the way. They would have to set the pace. They were the slowest, of course, but it was better to have them set the pace than the men who would eventually leave the women and children behind. At Jesus' age, it wasn't unusual for him to be with either group. He could be with the women or children, or he could hang back with the men. So I would imagine each parent thought that Jesus was with the other group. And they got panicky when they saw he was not with either group. Now, have any of us ever misplaced a child?